So, good morning. Today we're gonna discuss about two very important energy resources for the energy transition. I put them under the title of Power from the Flows of Nature because we're talking about wind and we're talking about hydro. So in the first hour we'll see how we harvest, how we can harness energy from air. In the second one, from large masses of moving air. For the second one, out of large quantities of moving water. So I have to say that wind and hydro are not my specialties. So I try to condense into these slides what I consider the key information that are relevant in order to understand the key principles of how these two energy resources work, and especially in the way you will need them in order to understand their role into the energy transition. So we will discuss about the key characteristics of wind in terms of resource and so on, the basic physics, the basic equation. Actually, there is a very elegant demonstration that we, a very elegant mathematical proof we can have to see how much is the maximum energy that we can harness out of a given amount of wind. And then we'll see also in detail how we integrate wind in the energy system. So, as any other renewable energy source, wind ultimately comes from solar. So wind, as you know, is massive amount of air in motion. We have wind because we have difference in pressure between high and lower pressure caused by the different way in which the sun heats the earth. And there's also minor components due to wind, which are associated with the rotation of the Earth, so the Coriolis effect, and friction caused to the contact with the Earth's surface. When the Earth's surface is uneven, this creates turbulence and can change also the profile of wind speed. So, when we consider wind, we normally consider that we have a controlled volume, as in this case here. We consider that we have an undisturbed flow of wind at speed v equal v0, and we consider a control volume. We take a part of the air and we isolate it in order to study its properties. So some basic equations that you will need to remember during this lecture. First of all, the amount of air that you circulate is equal to the density times the volume. So it will be, of course the volume is equal to the area here, times the height of this cylinder, which will be equal to the speed times the variation in time. And the mass flow is the derivative of a mass, so it will be the density times the area times the speed of the wind. This means that the kinetic energy of the wind, the amount of energy that is contained by moving air, will be equal to this equation that you know from basic physics, so one half of a mass of air times the square of the speed, which results in this equation, which is the amount of kinetic energy contained in a mass of moving wind at the speed v0, and out of which we can derive the fundamental equation, which is the power contained in a given amount, in a given volume of wind, which is equal to 1/2 times the density, times the area, times the speed at the third. Okay? So this is the first key equation that you see in this lecture, is the main one about wind. Actually, I'll also write it down on the blackboard because you will need it for a small exercise later. So if we have a given amount of wind, a given mass of wind, moving at speed v0, the power that the wind has is embedded inside the wind is equal to 1/2 times the density of air, times the surface that we're considering, times the speed of the wind at the third. Okay? So this is the key equation, the key equation of wind, and the key equation you need for the designing of wind power, of wind turbines. So historically, as you know, the wind has been used for different ways. We have windmills already finding in history from several thousand years ago, mostly for pumping water, for sailboats, and for milling and mechanical work. It has had the first major development during the Middle Ages in the Netherlands to dry the polders with the windmills that you have there. And also fighting against windmills has historical roots. You might remember from the Don Quixote that I cite here, that there is this scene in which he fights against windmills thinking that they are giants. And then Sancho tells him that is not really the case. So this was happening in the 1600s in one of the key books of I would say, literature. But also today, you might see that there is quite a lot of controversy about wind. You hear about a lot the not in my backyard concept, which means many people would say, okay, we like wind energy, something that we should do, but just not in my backyard. And also if you try to Google wind, you see that there are mixed opinions about what people look for about wind farms. So, but let's see what is the role of wind energy today. So, wind energy is actually a very rapidly developing technology. It covers today about 3.5% of the global electricity production. It is rising very quickly. And as you can see, there are some countries, and I would say above all China, which are growing very fast in terms of installed wind capacity. And actually, I would like you to make a little calculation. Don't you notice anything strange in these numbers that I have here? When I saw them, I was a bit surprised, I have to say. I thought there was a mistake in the statistics. Don't you find anything strange in these numbers that I have here? Anyone? So if you look at that, first of all, I ask you in the meantime to calculate also what is the capacity factor of wind in China. So do you remember what the capacity factor is? The capacity factor is the ratio. We call it CP with minor c in this case because we will use the big C today as well. Is the amount of the electricity produced, okay, over 1 year, for example, over the maximum electricity that we could have produced over 1 year, okay? If we would use the wind turbine all the time. So, I ask you to calculate that. Do you notice anything strange?
I mean, China has almost double the capacity of the United States, but the United States produces more hours than China.
Exactly. That's pretty impressive. And actually, so let's try actually to make this calculation, and then we'll see why this happens. So, what is the capacity factor of wind in China? Given, actually, do you want to see the number as well? So the installed capacity is 129.3 gigawatt, and the production is 186 terawatt hours. Okay, out of this information you can calculate the capacity factor. ask you then to remain connected. There will be still a couple of another 2 questions during the lecture. Is anyone still calculating? Raise your hand if you still need a bit of time. Okay, can I close the poll? Okay. So yes, remember the capacity factor is a very important parameter. In general, remember what it is. So it's the ratio among the electricity that we actually produce compared to the maximum electricity that we could produce if we would use the installed capacity of 8,760 hours a year. And the reason, actually, I was also surprised by this data, I have to say. I went and checked on the reason. I found this paper which basically details the difference. So there is already a better resource of wind. So we start from an initial better resource of wind in the United States. And then the main thing in China is about the way in which the wind turbines are connected to the grid. So due to a more difficult management of the grid, probably linked to the size, there is a higher need for curtailment. So it means that the wind turbines sometimes will lose some of the electricity because of grid management reasons, because we have to detach them from the grid. And there's also a delay in grid connection and the fact that we are not using the last models of the wind turbines that are available. So overall, the wind turbine, the capacity factor that we have of wind turbines in China installed today is half of the capacity factor of, for example, the wind turbines that we have installed in the US, which is quite an impressive difference. If we look in Europe, I told you, wind energy is growing really quickly. So we have today around 170 gigawatt installed of wind power in Europe, out of which about 10% is offshore wind. And it covers around 12% of the electricity demand today. But what is really impressive is that if you look at the last data, so these are data from 2017, actually almost all the new investment in capacity are made on renewable energy sources, mostly wind and solar. So out of $1 which is invested today in new capacity in electricity generation in Europe, you see that more than 75% is on renewable sources and more than 50% is on wind. And as you see, so here in this graph you have in blue the current installed capacity and the new installed capacity is in light blue. You see that Germany in Europe is the country with the highest investments at the moment. And you see that it's growing really fast. So this is the capacity of wind compared to the growth of the other renewable sources. You see that wind is basically now the second power generation, let's say, resource after natural gas in Europe. And compared to the other sources, it has really a quite impressive growth. In Switzerland, we have almost no wind today. This is related to 2 factors, I would say. It's related to the fact that there is usually in Switzerland a relatively low public acceptance of wind turbines. Let's say the not in my backyard movement is quite strong. And we'll see later that we have also in Switzerland, wind speeds are not as good as in other countries. This doesn't really, I mean, we still have capacity factors which are around 20%, so they are not particularly low, yet is one of the causes that contributes to the perception that wind energy is not such a good alternative for Switzerland, even if the data do not really back up this kind of view. If we look at the potential, just in brief, wind energy is expected to increase more or less at the same speed, at the same rate as it has increased today. It will reach roughly 20% of the world energy production in the next year, according to the International Energy Agency. And of course, wind depends on where we install it. So you can see that there are some areas in which it is more interesting to install wind turbines. There is some areas in which it is less interesting to install wind turbines. For example, as you can see here, Switzerland and northern Italy, for example, are not particularly favorable area in terms of wind speed, because remember that the power depends on the speed at the square. Okay, so at the third. So an increase of wind speed has a really big impact on the electricity you can produce out of a wind turbine. So the amount of power that we can harvest. So this is really important in a sense. It gives you the order of magnitude that when you design a wind turbine, the diameter and the speed so the location on which you build a wind turbine and the size of a wind turbine, it's a key factor in the design of it. So let's now look at how wind is distributed. So let's look at the resource of wind. In this case, what we have is that wind, as you know, varies from time to time, from location to location, and also from hour to hour. And what we want to know is the speed of the wind and the direction. So you have variation at yearly level and at seasonal level. These two variations influence the total electricity production that you have. And then you have also variation at smaller time scale, which are more important for the actual design of the turbines. Now let's imagine to be in any resource. So you are in a given resource and you measure the amount of wind that you have available over a given amount of time. So what you can do is that you can plot on this graph the wind speed on the x-axis and the frequency, so how many times the wind falls into one of these velocity bins on the y-axis, okay? What you will notice is something like this, okay? So if you measure wind for a sufficiently long amount of time, you have a distribution looking like that. So here, if you try to interpolate this distribution, which has, so the integral below the area will be equal to 1, what you will obtain is that you can approximate the distribution of wind at a given place, at a given location, with what is called the Weibull distribution. So the Weibull distribution has a relatively complex formulation, but it has only two parameters, which are C and K. In this case, for this particular distribution, C and K would be 9.3 and 1.8. C is related to the average speed of wind. So in this distribution, the fact that C means the value of C is 9.3 means that 63% of the speed of the values is below 9.3, and K is linked to the variance. So if you know the distribution of wind in a given location, you know the mean and you know the standard deviation, you can calculate the distribution of wind that allows you to forecast how much power you can produce out of your wind turbine installed there. And actually, you have tools such as this one that I posted online in Switzerland. You can just enter the distribution of the wind and it will give you in output the function. So the shape of the function that you can use to make your predictive model of your turbine. And remember that power is proportional to the square of the speed. So the distribution of the frequency will be something like the blue one, whereas the distribution of the power will have a sort of a shape as the other one, because it will follow the cubic of the speed. So let's now look at the key equations that are the basics of wind energy. I put them here because in wind you can actually have a quite elegant proof of how much power you can harness out of a given amount of wind at a given speed. So let's recall this key equation again. So you remember this is I put the numbers here so it's easier to follow and also to recheck at home. So the first equation that we need is to know that the power of wind is equal to 1/2 times the density, times the area, times the speed at the square. Then we can represent a wind turbine with the diagram up there. So let's say we will have an expansion of wind, of this volume of wind after the wind turbine. And the second law that we can write is the conservation of mass. So the mass that is in input to the wind turbine will be equal to the mass which is in output of the wind turbine, right? So the density is the same, goes away. We can always have that the area times the speed is equal at every point. This is because mass cannot go away. The third equation that we need is the Bernoulli principle. So Bernoulli principle can be applied before and after the turbine, and it tells us that the sum of the pressure divided by the density plus the square of the velocity divided by 2 and the G times Z, which is the potential energy due to the height difference, will be constant. So this we can apply before and after the turbine, not of course during the turbine, because there we have a loss of kinetic energy, we have a transfer of mechanical work to the turbine. And before and after the turbine we do not have any difference in height, so the difference will be only in pressure and speed. So these are the key fundamental principles that we will need to derive our formulation. Let's now check what happens before and after the turbine. So a turbine is a device that can extract energy from the wind. So what we have is that if we look at the pressure and velocity fields, before the turbine we have that there is a decrease in wind speed and an increase of pressure. So Bernoulli applies before the turbine, right? At the moment in which we have the effect of passing through the turbine causes, of course, a drop in pressure because mechanical power is transferred as mechanical work to the turbine. After that, we have still a decrease in wind speed and a re-increase of pressure because again we can reapply the Bernoulli principle after the turbine. Okay, so this is the physics of what happens, and what happens is that we are giving the kinetic energy of the wind, we are transferring to kinetic motion of the turbine. So how does this work in terms of equations? So we can represent a wind turbine in this way. So we have that we call V0 the speed of the wind undisturbed. So the wind outside the turbine will be at V0 and atmospheric pressure. We will have a zone 1 and a zone 2 which are before and after the turbine, sufficiently before and sufficiently after. And then we'll have an in and out which is just before and after the turbine. So here there are some equations that I'll derive in order to show you a nice elegant demonstration, which is the maximum amount of power that we can extract out of a wind turbine. So first of all we can do, you know that the force is the derivative of momentum, right? So force will be, the first equation that we can write is that actually the delta T goes away there, so is that the force is equal to the density times the area times the velocity at whatever point, because the area and the velocity for the conservation of mass are always the same, times the difference in speed. So this is the first equation that we can write. The second, if we look here, so before and after the turbine, we can also say that the force which is acting on the turbine will be equal to the area of the turbine itself, times the difference in pressure. So this will be the force, the pressure that the turbine will feel. And we can combine these two equations to get equation number 3 here, which we will need at a later stage. So here we're just building up the things that we need for the proof. And also, we can apply Bernoulli's principle. We can apply it before and after the turbine. So what we know is that upstream and downstream, we can apply the fact that the pressure times the sum of half of the speed square times the density will be equal. We can apply it before the turbine, we can apply it after the turbine, and then we can put these two equations together to get this other equation. Okay? So let's put these two equations up there, and let's add the last equation we need, which is looking at the kinetic energy of the wind turbine. Kinetic energy of the wind turbine will be basically the difference between the kinetic energy of the air before and after the turbine, right? So this is what actually is transferred to the turbine. So it will be, as you know, 1/2 times the mass of the air times the difference of the speed squared. we can apply the equation number 2 of mass conservation as we did before. And then, just doing some mathematical tricks that you can redo at home, just multiplying and dividing by V0 in this case, then you collect V0, you get to this final formulation. So this is a key equation. This is the key equation of wind energy. It tells us that the work that we can extract out of a wind turbine is equal to what? Is equal to 2 components. You see here, you recognize it here, is the power, the kinetic energy, which is contained in the wind flow, times a constant part, which just depends on the ratio between the speed before and after the turbine. Okay? So, again, this part here is the same equation we wrote at the beginning of the lecture, so it's the amount of power which is contained in the wind, multiplied by the power coefficient, which is a constant depending only on the wind speed. Okay? Do you have any questions up now, until here?
Just for the last equation, why do you consider A2 not A1? Since you're considering B2 below, like, you consider the area of the turbine or of the inlet of the control valve?
So the areas here are always different. AT is this one. Is the surface at the level of the turbine.
But
okay.
The node, like the Z before, even if it reaches 18.
Come again?
I mean, is the node the velocity at 18, isn't it the end, or?
So the speed will decrease gradually. You have that the speed of the turbine will be lower than the initial velocity V1, and then the final speed will be even lower. So the area will gradually increase as soon as you as you gradually cross the turbine, the wind, as you saw before, the wind speed will gradually go down. So the area, due to the conservation of mass, will gradually increase. Okay? And so this is a key equation. And what does it mean in practice? We need to calculate how much this power coefficient is. And this depends on the ratio of the speed after and below the turbine. So this ratio, we call it X, normally. So it's basically the ratio V2 divided by V0, we call it X. So V2 cannot be 0, of course, because the air cannot just fall down at the end of the turbine, right? We need to have some leftover speed after that. And actually, we can derive out of this equation, we can put these equations together. So I let them on the slide so you have them, but basically, just by using these 3 equations that we found out in the previous slide, you can derive a final formulation which is expressing the wind turbine, the power out of a wind turbine, only as a function of the power in the wind and a function of X. At this point, if you want to find the maximum power, you derive this equation, you put it equal to 0, and you find that the maximum amount of speed of mechanical work that you can extract out of a given amount of power in the wind is equal to 59.3% of the energy of the mechanical power which is contained in the wind. So this is the main formula of wind energy. It's called the depth limit. It's an equation that was derived in the early 1900s, and it's basically equivalent, if you remember from the thermodynamics, it's equivalent to the amount of maximum work that we can produce out of 2 heat sources. So it's the equivalent, is the Carnot factor, if you want, for wind energy. It tells us, however you design your turbine, you'll never be able to get more than this amount of energy from the wind. Okay? And this is called the power coefficient, and the nice thing is that we can derive it analytically with some quite basic physics equation. Okay? Any questions about this? Okay. So, as I said, the depth limit gives us a theoretical limit, so it tells us how much of the wind energy that we have we can convert into mechanical power. And we know that the maximum will be 59.3%. So the power coefficient is defined as the actual energy that we can harvest from the turbine compared to the amount of power in the wind. If we plot it in a graph in which we put x here on the x-axis, okay? So the ratio between the speed, and we put the power coefficient on the top, we can actually plot this equation, right? And we see that the maximum, as we show analytically before, will be equal to 1/3 of the speed. So the V2 at the exit of the turbine will be equal to 1/3 of the speed. And as you were asking before in your question, you can prove that at the maximum speed, the speed at the turbine will be equal exactly to 2/3 of the initial speed. So you have a sort of, well, it's not a linear decrease, but you have that full speed at the beginning, then you have 2/3 at the moment in which you pass the turbine, and 1/3. So this is the maximum power. And in practical values, so in reality, you have a bit lower values. As usual, you have losses and so on. And in practice, you get to something which is normally up to 50%. So you usually do not get to 59.3%. You have some losses. And these losses come from different factors, but the main factor that we see is what happens in wind farms. So in wind farms, often, we can have wake losses. So wake is defined as this region that you see in the picture here from one of the major wind farms in Denmark. And you can see that the amount of what happens is that you can have some turbulence after the first row of turbines, which reduces the amount of wind energy which is available for the second rows and so on. So of course this does not always happen, but if there are some configuration and some particular angles at which wind impacts the turbine, you can have a strong reduction which can be, I mean, here you see that you have a reduction of about 30% from the first to the second row. And actually, this is a slide that, this is a picture that I took from a work from Paul Tergel, the professor here at DBFL teaching wind and researching on wind energy. Actually, predicting this kind of performance is quite difficult and is one of the major elements of research. So you have losses related to this wake phenomenon. And then you have also other losses which are, for example, the fact that you have some turbulence which is created at the tip of the blades and can create some axial forces that can reduce the amount of work that you can harvest out of wind. And then you have what are called drag losses, which are basically given by the fact that we are not able to entirely transmit the motion of the wind into a rotational speed, but we have also a component which is called drag, so we have also an axial component which slows down the turbine. And actually,
just a question about the V0 and V2 ratio.
Yeah?
This ratio depends on the distance to only to the wind turbine, or also to the wind turbine and the conditions?
Well, the ratio will depend on the design on the wind turbine.
Okay.
The ratio.
If we take two wind turbines exactly the same, but at two different places, they will have the same.
Well, you have phenomenon if you have, for example, this kind of turbulence in case of wake losses, which becomes at, so let's say in design condition, yes. So at design condition you have the same thing. In practical application, if you have this phenomenon of wake, you have a different performance. If the wind is the same in the two cases, you have the same performance. So given the same design and the same angle of impact and the same speed of input, you can predict the performance. The fact is that what will happen in local cases is that due to how the Earth is shaped, you have turbulence which is very local. So in practice, you'll never measure the same value because the fact of having a valley, the fact of having some sort of turbulence will always cause some sort of difference from a location to the other. That's actually why we build wind farms offshore. Because in offshore we usually have the sea, so we don't have major impacts. We have a quite still and very high wind speed that we can harvest. But when you start having mountains and so on, the input condition will be always a bit different. So you'll never have the same exact values, basically. Even if theoretically you would.
When you say value, like the value of power or CP? Like the coefficient?
Well, that's the same. I mean, the CP relates the amount of energy that you have contained in the wind to the actual amount that you are producing at a given moment. So let's now look at the forces which act on a turbine. So you might remember from, you might already know how an airplane works, right? Why an airplane remains, so remains how it is lifted. So basically, an airplane has a similar principle of working of a wind turbine. Because the only difference is that the relative speed is different because the airplane moves, and so it has a, let's say, and the wind turbine not, right? But in terms of relative speed, we can make the same comparison. So what happens on the wing on an airplane? So we have the airfoil theory. Basically, what we have is that the wing is impacted by an airflow. The airflow, so the trick is building the upper side of the wing with a longer path. The lower part will be shorter. So if we apply Bernoulli Principle above and below, you know that speed and pressure always have to sum up to the same value, well, speed at the square. So what you have is that you have a lower speed and a higher pressure below. And this creates the lift force that we need for airplanes, right? And so, and also we'll always have a tangential part because we cannot completely eliminate the drag force, which is basically the resistance, somehow the friction that we have. And our goal in designing an airplane, as in designing a wind turbine, is to try to have as much lift as possible compared to the drag. So basically what you want to have is that if you calculate the lift and the drag coefficient, you want to maximize that ratio. And the wind turbines works in the same way. So the wind turbine is hit in this way by wind, okay? This will create a drag force and a lift force. The lift force is actually what you need in order to move the turbine. The drag force is what penalizes you in the design, okay? So the kind of situation that we have in a wind turbine, you can imagine it in the same, without entering in the detail of how wind turbines blades are designed, you can relate it to the same way in which an airplane works. And let's look at how wind turbines are integrated into energy systems. So we'll quickly look at what are the types of wind turbines, what are the key components, the design parameter, and how a wind turbine will actually work in practice. So the fact that they have given operating ranges and they are used in wind farms. Okay, so the key classification that we have is that we have a classification between vertical and horizontal axis. So the main ones that we find in practice are the horizontal axis that we find that is mostly for design and construction reasons. The vertical axis are basically more niche application for some specific issues, and some of them they use also the drag force. They are not lift based. The key components that we have inside the wind turbine, so here gives you a zoom on what is happening on the top of a wind turbine. The key components will be that we have the motion transmitted to a gearbox. So the gearbox will be able to transform the rotational speed of a wind turbine into a speed which is compatible to the alternator. And actually, the alternator is what is normally limiting the design of a wind turbine, because if we go too high in speed, for example, during a storm, what can happen is that the alternator will, at some point, will just burn and collapse. So that's why we need to stop the turbines at some point for safety reasons. And we have also the mechanical brakes, and another key component is the yaw controller. So basically, we will be able to direct always the wind turbine in order to face the wind in the most efficient way. When we look at the design of a wind turbine, as I told you before, the key components are the size of the turbine, so the diameter, the area, because that's proportional to the amount of speed. We have the number of blades, the rated power, and we have also the height, which is normally proportional to the diameter. So as you can see in this graph, normally you have a quite direct linear correlation between the diameter, not linear actually, but almost linear correlation between the diameter and the hull height. The number of blades, actually, as you know from the formula there, the number of blades will not in theory impact the installed power. So because the power depends only on the total area, so the area will be the same if you have 1, 2, or 3 blades. What we notice is that normally the reason why we design turbines in a given way are related to aesthetics, to cost, and to structural reasons. So, actually in practice what we notice is that between 1 and 2 blades, we generally have a design which is cheaper, is also easier to find a balance between the inertia of the turbine. We have less axial forces on the, and we also have a gain in practical efficiency based on measured data. Of course, not in theory, but based on measured data. And the most common design, as you know, as you saw around, is the 3 blades, which actually is not so much better than the 2-blade system. The fact is that it is advantageous because in practice it produces less noise, and so it is better for onshore application. Actually, 2 blades are sometimes considered the future for offshore applications, because there you can also have more noise, and so it's easier to, you can also build them there. Having multiple blades, in theory, it will allow you to reach the maximum theoretical efficiency. In practice, it doesn't make sense, because when we build them, we have a very high solidity, so a very high torque that we have on the turbine, which causes design problems and is not balanced by a gain in efficiency of the turbine. And let's look at this thing, and then we can do a pause. It's how the wind turbines are actually operated. So, if we look at how the power over against velocity is distributed, so we will have 3 key speeds. One is the cut-in, one is the cut-out, and then there is the rated speed. So basically, the cut-in is the minimum speed at which we decide to run the turbine, because below the energy the electricity we will produce is so low that it doesn't even make sense to run it, because we preserve the turbine, okay, for maintenance reasons. Then we have an area in which the turbine power will be proportional to the square, to the cubic of the increase of speed, and this will be basically before the V rated. And the V rated is the speed at which the design is actually built. At that point, what you do is that you don't have any more an increase proportional to the cubic of the power. You actually keep it constant. So what you do is that in this area, you move the turbine, you change the inclination of the blade, and you can even create stall in order to make sure that the turbine does not run over this amount of rated power. And then at some point, if the speed is too high, so some rare events such as a thunderstorm and so on, you shut it down in order to preserve it from mechanical failure. So as I said, to keep the power constant here, you have 3 different ways. So basically, you can change the pitch, you can change the yaw, so you can change how much directly the wind is faced, and you can even create situation of stall. So situation of stall is the same you have in airplanes, where at some point the difference in pressure and the inclination is too high, and you have a collapse of the pressure on the upper side, which basically would cause an airplane to fall, okay? And normally what happens is that turbines in theory could be run also at variable speed. This is not, and it would be more efficient to run them, because we will be able better to follow the speed of the wind. But there are design criteria, such as, for example, the fact of having more stability and cost reason, which usually have the rotation of the turbine is kept constant to the link to the alternator. Okay. And the last thing is that wind turbines are growing in size. So as you see, wind turbines are very big, and actually General Electric just announced a 12 megawatt wind turbine, which would have blades which are longer than 100 meters. So you have to imagine how big these turbines happen to be, and how difficult it can be to transport them. So they are really, the challenge is making them as big as possible, because of course they will be more efficient and they will produce more power. And as you've seen before, normally we have them distributed in wind farms. So the wind farms is what you find, for example, one of the biggest one is if you land, for example, in Copenhagen, you'll see this wind farm, and actually Denmark is investing heavily on turbines. I think it's forecasting to get 4 gigawatt of wind in the next year, and it will be mostly offshore, because we have higher capacity factor, higher speed, and we can also produce more noise. So I would propose you to make a 15 minutes break now, and then I'll finish another 5–10 minutes on wind, and then will be the hydro part, which will be a bit shorter. And if you have questions, either you can ask them now or you can come over. Okay, so some last elements which are important to know about wind is how we integrate actually wind in the energy system, right? So I won't talk about the dynamics related to storage because there will be a lecture only on storage in which we will address more in detail these kind of topics. Let's look at some key items. For example, what are the capacity factors that we find in practice? So in practice today, capacity factors, you can estimate a value of around 25% capacity factor on onshore and around 35% for offshore wind. Okay, I told you before that in Switzerland we have a bit lower capacity factors. It is not so ideal to build wind turbines, but anyway they are in the order of magnitude of around 20% today and expected to increase in the future. And you also have, there are actually some developments of turbines that are made for low wind speed, which can achieve high capacity factor also at low wind speed. The value you have in your model, in the model that you have in the energy scope for your project is 23% for the future value in Switzerland. Cost is heavily decreasing. Actually, if you look at what the IEA, the International Energy Agency, was forecasting years ago, they were forecasting prices for 2035, which are basically already reached today. I was checking in this report from 2017. There is around 22.3 billion euros announced of investments in Europe, which correspond to 11.5 gigawatts. So if you make the math, it's around 1,900, including all the cost of investment. And the price is around 5 cents per kilowatt hour, 5–6 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's very competitive wind already today without any, let's say, financial incentive or so on for electricity production. And you see from this curve here, this shows you how the capital cost has decreased in the last 20–30 years. So as well as with solar, it's heavily decreasing and it's already quite competitive. And an interesting thing to mention is that, again, if you look in, for example, in Germany, where there has been a big deployment of both wind and solar, you have an interesting dynamics in which over the seasons, so wind is usually is stronger in winter than in summer, solar is much stronger in summer than in winter, and actually on a seasonal basis they can be complemented, and partially also on a daily basis, although the fact that wind produces more at night than at day, it's location dependent. It's something that is generally in various locations is true, but not everywhere. And then there are some risks related to wind turbines as well. It's normally due to some failure of some mechanical components. It can happen, for example, like you had in Denmark in this video here. So probably some of you understand what's here. So this was mostly to show you a nice video, I would say, but it can be that you have these kind of failures, normally due to the fact that when the speed goes up, the brakes is not able to brake because it fails and the alternator burns, and it can happen, these kind of things can happen. There are also some other perceived noise, so people usually do not like wind turbines because they are ugly, which is something which of course depends on taste. I personally do not dislike them, I don't know if you do, but some people surely do not. There is the effect of noise, and noise actually, normally houses are built at maximum 300 meters from wind turbines. So the noise at around 500 meters is equivalent to the noise to around 40 decibel, which is the noise of a compressor in a fridge. So I would say the noise is mostly a myth, because if you're below the turbine it's actually noisy, but where the houses are built are not. And then there is this other thing that you will hear a lot in the press, is that if you Google wind turbines, the main issue about wind turbines that you hear is that they kill a lot of birds. So this is the last thing I wanted to ask you today, is what you think is the main cause of bird death currently? So I see from a number of answers that you're more motivated in answering to this kind of question than to... Okay. So let's see what you say. Okay, I'll close the poll now. Okay, so actually you're right. Cats, according to these statistics that I found, are the biggest cause of avian deaths in the US today. So apparently, but looking at Facebook and Instagram, people seem to like cats more than wind turbines. So I mean, if anyway, this study is a study that was published in 2009, which was a bit provocative. It was called the avian benefits on wind energy. I would say that there is some controversy about this study. You can imagine that when you see this kind of study, the first question you should have in your mind is, how did he get the statistics? Okay, it's evidently not so easy to calculate this kind of thing. But anyway, from different studies that there has been around, the orders of magnitude are quite clear. Wind turbines are not a major danger for birds. They do kill some birds, of course, but the impacts, for example, caused by climate change are bigger than the damages that can be built on wind turbines. So I would say this is a myth that you hear quite often. It's not untrue, but of course the size of the phenomenon needs to be contextualized, okay? So apart from the fact that wind doesn't kill many birds, the other messages you can have from this lecture is that wind is a key player for the energy transition. In Switzerland, you will see that the projections of the Swiss Federal Office of Energy will tell you that there will be not much wind in the future in Switzerland. So I would say you, as part of people who might work in this field of energy, you have to question this kind of assumptions. And for example, in Switzerland, it mainly comes from public acceptance. So there's also a role in probably communicating better the benefits of some technology compared to the others. So I showed you also some key physics of wind. Probably the main thing that you should remember is that formula there. And as you saw, I also put a mistake in the calculation just to see if you were paying attention to the lecture. And these are the key basics that you should remember, especially about the integration in the system. So with that, I am done with energy. I'll switch to hydro. If in the meantime you have some questions on wind, I can answer them.